Welcome to the CCVO Capacity Building webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land we at CCVO live on and are proud to call home. The traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation, Region Number 3, and all the people who make their home on the treaty region of Southern Alberta. We are all treaty people. This series is focused on topics that'll help nonprofit professionals and the organizations they work with build their capacity and strengthen their impact. Thank you to our sponsors, Land Solutions and Altitude Communications, for their support of the CCVO webinar series. If you are watching this webinar live, we encourage you to post your questions in the question box, which you will find on the right of your screen for the live Q&A portion of this webinar and the follow-up blog post. For this webinar on diversity, equity, and inclusion, identifying and addressing systemic issues in the workplace, we're joined by Anila Lee Yuen of Center for Newcomers. Anila is the president and CEO of the Center for Newcomers. She has over 25 years of experience in the settlement sector, and since joining the organization in 2016 with the support of a staff team 160 strong, Anila has grown the agency by 5 million, adding nationally recognized programming such as LGBTQ+, refugee supports, and Indigenous education for newcomers. Anila continues to strongly advocate for vulnerable persons, especially women and children. She's also a recipient of the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the person's case in 2001 for her work advocating for the rights of immigrant and minority women and children in Canada. Other accolades include University of Calgary Alumni Award, Top 40 Under 40 designation, Women of Inspiration, and most recently, Top 25 Women of Influence in Canada. Anila, it is such a pleasure and honor for you to join us today.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I really did want to just start off by saying that, I'm going to be speaking much more experiential. It's been, I had an opportunity to take a look at who's going to be on the webinar today and watching, and I'm really humbled and really honored to see so many people with so much expertise that have chosen to tune in today. I will, like I said, speak much more experientially. And what I really wanted to really speak to and focus on is the fact that, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, we often will talk about things in very, and pardon the pun, but very black and white kinds of ways of looking at things, right? Like it's either this or it's either this. And in the absence of things that are completely egregious in terms of the law, in terms of human rights, in terms of very cut and dry kinds of situations, most things that happen in the workplace related to diversity, equity, and inclusion are really in this gray area. And they can move and shift and evolve and change, really dependent on the organization, dependent on who's making up the organization, and that can change over the years and over who's involved in those specific conversations. So I'd really like to put out there that of course we will always maintain, and we always should maintain equity and inclusion and adhering to the law and adhering to ethics. If any of the situations that you end up working with in the workplace are related to safety or health or the law, call the police, call 911. If not so, but definitely very specific, and you need to terminate an employee or you need to do things, talk to your HR, talk to your lawyers, talk to your board, as a not-for-profit, and make sure that you do things in the appropriate, equitable, ethical, law-abiding ways. What I'm going to talk to you about today is of course where you can get more information on those things, but really more around those gray areas. Okay, so I'm really happy that Mary was able to include a land acknowledgement in the beginning. Center for Newcomers has a land acknowledgement that we use. We have 10 Indigenous elders from Treaty 7 that work with us as our Indigenous Council as part of our Indigenous education for newcomers. And so they have created a land acknowledgement as well, but I'm going to skip over that since Mary already did a wonderful job with the land acknowledgement today. Today, our learning objectives are really going to be around identifying underlying systemic issues in your organization. How do you do that? Strategies to address workplace conflict and change. And then the strategies and tools are really around being able to identify systemic issues, being able to address those issues, and having knowledge of resources to assist. Okay. The agenda will be, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Center for Newcomers. In case you don't know who we are, I'm going to provide you with some common don'ts. I'm actually going to start with, instead of these are the excellent things that you can do, I'm actually going to start with what you should probably stay clear of in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. We're going to talk about a couple of cultural competency tools that are very easy to use as a foundation. Many of you might be already familiar with them. And then we're going to go into a real life example, a case study. If some of you had joined me a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was even a month ago with CCVO with the HR at Noon series that we did around some of these issues with diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. I did do a series of case studies there. This one is a different one. I am a wealth of incidents that have happened that we deal with. It is just a regular part of life, and I have so many case studies and so many different things that we can always talk about, and many more if you'd like to get more into that. The next thing that we're going to talk about is some practice best practices, some tips in terms of what best practices are. And then if you're looking for more information, and specifically more of the academic type information, the more scientifically based information, we've got a number of local resources, wonderful facilitators, wonderful people in the community that do excellent work around diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace that can assist you. And then lastly, I'd like to leave a little bit of time for question and answers. So for Q&A, if anyone has any questions, I'm hoping that there's an ability for some sort of, maybe typing in or something like that. So if people do have any questions that they can definitely ask. So with that, I will start with telling you a little bit about the Center for Newcomers. If you don't know who we are, we've been around since 1988. And we work with immigrants and refugees of all nationalities from all over the world. And where we feel that our mission is a little bit unique in terms of the work that we do is that we not only work with newcomers, immigrants and refugees, but that's only 50% of what we do. The other 50% is working with the community to welcome newcomers. So we work with the receiving community as well. And our real hope is to create a welcoming environment in Calgary for everyone, where everyone feels safe and included. A little bit in terms of our statistics, we see about 15,000 clients per year. Pre-COVID, there was 1,000 people coming through our doors every single day. And we've actually increased the number of people that we see because of the pandemic. We were looking at approximately 10,000 people per year that were coming through our doors post-COVID, or sorry, pre-COVID, and now it's about 15,000. We do have our offices open for the most vulnerable people that cannot access services online, but that is all by appointment. So they can come in and make an appointment, but then they will need to come back unless it's a crisis situation where we will have somebody address that. We only have about 10 to 15% of our staff in the offices at the moment. Everybody else is working online. Another piece of information is that we do have 160 employees that work on our team, and our budget is currently about 14 million. Primarily coming from the federal government, from Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada. Some of our programming that we're the most proud of includes our LGBT+ newcomer resiliency programming, our Indigenous education for newcomers. We do a lot of work for vulnerable populations and supporting vulnerable populations through homelessness, through domestic violence, through any of those kind of pieces. We do career services for artists. We also do career services in first language. So we have the largest career services employment center for newcomers in first language. We did a legacy campaign around the importance of newcomers to Calgary. We do volunteer-led refugee integration, financial literacy. We do an orange ribbon campaign when it's not COVID, which is specifically related to World Refugee Day, which is June 20th. We have our ethnicity catering. I hope you all get an opportunity to try some of our wonderful food at ethnicity catering. It's a social enterprise where we have 64 newcomers that have never received or been able to get a job in Canada before, get paid to work, and also gain some wonderful life skills and career services skills. Our success rate is over 90% for them being employed after doing the training program. And of course, we also, something that's really important to me is that we offer women's empowerment classes, including women's self-defense. I am an avid martial artist, and so this is something near and dear to my heart in terms of a personal interest to have women feel that they have the tools beyond all of the life skills and everything else that we teach. Moving on, we also are currently at the Center for Newcomers. I am the chair of the Calgary COVID response that is focusing on the hot zones. The hot zones are currently in Northeast Calgary. So to provide you with a little bit more information on that, the Center for Newcomers leads the Calgary East Zone Newcomer Collaborative. And so through that, that's 17 organizations that work together, including the Action Dignity, Immigrant Education Society, Immigrant Services Calgary, Women in Need, the ALEX, YMCA, Momentum, Bridge Foundation for Youth, La Cité des Roches, Distress Center, Mosaic Primary Care Network, Prospect Human Services, Trellis, Calgary Public Library, the YW, and the Alberta International Medical Graduates Association. So those are our key groups. If you'd like more information in terms of what we are doing as the Northeast response, because that's where primarily the hot zones are, you can go to our Calgary Local Immigration Partnership website. That's calgarylip.ca/CENC. And you can get all kinds of information on how you can also participate, or if you have clients or anyone else in the community that has needs related to COVID, please do connect with us. Everything is through our Action Dignity is running a hotline. It's 1-833-217-6614. All of that information is on the Calgary Local Immigration Partnership website as well. And then just a little bit of context in terms of the Center for Newcomers. One of the things that we are supporting is the food hampers. This year alone, we have provided almost 20,000 people with culturally comforting food hampers. Since December 17th, when we started in the hot zones with the CENC response, that's about 10,000 people that we have served. So we're very proud of that, and we're always looking for community partners to assist in terms of working with the community on food security. We have a number of partnerships already, as you can see, including Bow West, Leftovers Foundation, Northeast Family Connections, Fresh Roots, number of faith-based organizations and groups, the Humane Society, Food Bank, but we're always looking for more. And then the other piece that we are in charge of is the income support piece. So that's for people that don't meet any criteria for benefits and need to be are laid off or don't, and are in fear of homelessness. We have provided 566 microloans or micro grants, depending on the situation. The average support period is 2.5 months, and the average loan or grant amount is about $1,000. We're typically doing about 70 per month. So again, if you have any resources that you would like to offer towards that, or if you have any clients that have needs in Northeast Calgary, actually, it's not only Northeast Calgary for the income support, it's all over the city. So if you do have anyone that needs assistance, please do let us know, and we will do our best to assist. Now, moving on to the topic of the day, I have some very specific don'ts for the workplace. Okay, one of the things that me and my team always see often when we're working with people around, their, audits around diversity, equity, inclusion, is that many organizations will rely on visual demographics. So they'll say, but I have 50% are women, and I can see that 2% of Calgary is Black. So 2% of my, staff team are Black. People actually say these things all the time. And it's a really big don't. We absolutely want to get to a place where our leadership and our staff and our entire workplace represents accurately and appropriately the demographics of our community. But diversity, equity, and inclusion is more than just visual cues, right? It's diversity of thought. It's definitely gender diversity. It's also sexual orientation. It's also people's spiritual beliefs. It's also all kinds of different things. And I know that you all know about when we talk about culture, when we talk about diversity, it's about abilities or, different abilities. And many of them, of course, are invisible, right? Whenever there's a survey or something to fill out in terms of, when people are looking for demographic data, when it's the government or whoever and census data or whatever that might be, I always will check off that I have a disability. People can't see it, but I have chronic depression. I've been taking antidepressants for 23 years now, but you can't see that. Nobody can see that on me. But I do have a disability and I do require special accommodation often at work because of that, right? And so it's really important that we're not only focusing on those visual demographics, or people just rely on the statistics, like I said, but I'm meeting the 50% gender parity. Well, if you are, that's wonderful. And I'm so grateful because most people aren't meeting the 50% gender parity. But also look at those statistics in terms of all different levels, and especially in terms of your leadership. So if you're an organization like the Center for Newcomers, those demographics should match at your leadership level, at your mid-management level, and also at your front line in terms of, the people that are actually doing the heavy lifting, right? And what does that look like? The other thing that I will say is don't force communication or team building around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Having these big fancy days that today we're going to celebrate all of your diversity and all of our, equity and inclusion, and we're going to do all of these things, and it's going to be all these team building activities, can really, really, really make people feel uncomfortable, especially if you haven't done a lot of the homework. And we will go into some of the best practices and some of the things that we should be doing, a little bit later on in the presentation. But it's just something to keep in mind right now, right? Like, we want people to feel comfortable. We want people to feel like they already have the tools in place to start communicating, right? If you don't provide people with the tools and you ask them to communicate and you haven't created the safe space to communicate and to build those relationships, then it can be very uncomfortable and very confusing for people, right? And different people, of course, have different levels of understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion, and different people have different personalities and different ways of looking at the world and how we communicate. And it can be very, very off-putting. People are always very confused by, I'm a very people person, right? I'm extroverted. I like to get to know people. I hate, like, I just cannot stand, they make me cringe. Two things. One is icebreakers. I hate having to walk around a room and do a little sheet and, try to figure out things or whatever. I'd rather just have people go around the room and just share a little bit about themselves or whatever so that we know who's in the room. But I really can't stand doing those things. And, I really, really hate those team building activities where you have to work together to solve something, right? Like, you have to take this one thing that's really heavy and move it from one location to another location, but you only have like thread to work with, and then you've got some kind of scientific something or the other. My brain doesn't work that way. And I'd like to think I'm somebody that likes to work in teams quite a bit and likes to participate with people, but my brain doesn't work that way. So without rapport, without, those kind of team building activities do not let me utilize the skills that I'm good at within team building, right? Because it's utilizing skills that actually just give me a lot of anxiety, right? So those kind of things are extremely important. And before I move forward, just let me tell you, it is so weird to be in this kind of a setting for me, where I can't see people's reactions. I can't see, what you might be thinking, or, not interacting, so I'm really, really looking forward to COVID being over. So hopefully we can do some of these things in person, where it could be much more interactive. My style is much more that, if you have a question, you just kind of blurt it out in the middle of my presentation, or we just kind of have a conversation around that. So I am trying to do my level best to keep you engaged and keep this interesting. But I do apologize if it's not coming across in my typical way that I usually do things. So, but I do really appreciate the opportunity to present today. Okay, so like we were talking about, before we get people to talk about things and express themselves, we want to be able to give people the tools, right? So maybe some communications tools. In the work that we do in cultural competency at the Center for Newcomers, and what we offer at the Center for Newcomers, is we use a model that was created by Dr. Milton Bennett. Okay, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but some of you may not have. The first time I saw this model, it just blew my mind, okay, because it really, really spoke to how to find a way of speaking about cultural competency specifically. Now, I know that there's many other types of diversity in the workplace and in our community, but really, even though we're talking about ethnocultural diversity within this intercultural sensitivity model, it can be used for other types of diversity as well. Okay, so to take you through that is there's really two types of stages, and it's very visual. Red means you don't want to be there, right? You really, as an organization and as people, in terms of being cohesive, in terms of being productive, in terms of being able to work together, and being able to serve your communities, you don't want to be in the red stage. Okay, you want to go into the green stages. Okay. So the red stages is really what Bennett refers to as ethnocentric stages. So the first one is denial, right? You just, nope, that's not true. That actually doesn't make any sense, okay? Your cultural experience is the only one that's real and valid, and there is little to no thought of anyone else. No, well, no, that absolutely can't be an issue, because I've worked hard my whole life, and because I've worked hard my whole life and I managed to go to college and pay for myself and be able to do all these things and get a good job, there couldn't possibly be any barriers that other people are facing. They're just lazy. Right? So that's an example of denial. You just absolutely don't believe that there are any other experiences beyond your own experiences, right? It's when you say things like, no, sweetie, like to your kid, right? No, sweetie, your friend is just confused. You can only like this, the opposite sex. No, that's not true. There's no such thing as being homosexual. That's complete denial, because you're only going based on your own lived experience, right? When you get into defense, then your belief is that you are superior and the other person is inferior, right? And so that's more like things like when we say Black Lives Matters and somebody turns around and says, well, that doesn't make any sense. All lives matter. Well, yes, Of course, all lives matter, but not all lives are being shot in the street or being disproportionately discriminated against currently by our major systems, right? Including in many countries and many places in the world, and especially in the United States, the police. So that is a defensive stance when you say all lives matter, as opposed to understanding why we say Black lives matter, okay? And then minimization. Minimization is that other cultures are trivialized or romanticized, or that there's no differences, right? But we're a merit-based society. There's no differences. Anila worked really, really hard, just like I worked really, really hard. That's why she's a CEO. She had no barriers or anything else. She had the same barriers as I did. You know, it didn't make any difference. I'm colorblind. I grew up in a family where we don't see differences. Now, I just heard yesterday a really important statistic from a wonderful woman that was part of another panel that I was in, and a consultant. And I don't remember her last name at the moment, but Judy was speaking about what she said was one of the biggest problems with minimization for us, specifically in Canada, is as Canadians, with our stereotypical quote unquote polite society, we tend to live in minimization. And this is a big detriment to our workplaces and to our culture as a whole. Being polite is wonderful, right? It is a part of who we are as Canadians. But taking it to the stage where we minimize everything because we don't want to get into conflict becomes a barrier to us actually being able to work through our issues and work through systemic discrimination and systemic barriers and systemic issues that are happening in all of our institutions and across our country and in all of our workplaces through unconscious bias and through, more blatant ways of keeping people that are in marginalized communities from being able to advance. So that's the one that I want you to really pay attention to, is how many times in a day do each of us, including me, I do it all the time. And like I said, yesterday it blew my mind that I was like, oh, we're consistently minimizing. It's not that bad. It's everybody goes through it. It's, I felt that same way, right? In certain circumstances that can help. But when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not helping. It's actually part of the ethnocultural or ethnocentric stages. When we get into the ethno-relative stages, though, that's where we want to be, right? Acceptance. I accept that that other person has differences than me, right? I may not agree with them, but I'm generally curious and I'm respectful, okay? The next stage is adaptation. I'm now able to see, you are now able to see the world through different eyes and make intentional changes to your own behavior and values. So for example, you may have been, one of the major transformations that have happened in a lot of organizations since Truth and Reconciliation is that we have started to use land acknowledgements. We are all learning about Indigenous ways of being. We're learning about protocol in terms of what is the appropriate way to engage with an elder. What do we say? How do we approach that, right? So we're trying to view the world in a different set of eyes than what we may be, right? If you're not Indigenous, then you're trying to look at the world through a different way, and you're making intentional changes to your own behaviors and your own values. You're adapting, right? Most of us are typically in that stage, especially when we're starting to the fact that we're even in this seminar today, in this webinar today, right? And then integration is where you're easily able to move in and out of different cultural worldviews, okay? Now, here's the secret. No one, I don't care how wonderful of a human being and how inclusive a human being you are, Nobody lives in adaptation and integration 24/7 all the time. It is really difficult. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of work to work in adaptation and specifically in integration. And because we all have our own biases, we all have our own values, we all have our own ways that the world that we have been taught based on, our own backgrounds and elders and whatever else that might influence our world. So we can be in acceptance all the time. That's something that I've seen quite often. We can be in adaptation even most of the time, but in integration is really mindfulness. It's really being mindful of the situations, and it's not something that most of us can consistently be in. So, I would encourage you to really look at the different issues and the different things that have come up in your own organizations and how people have reacted, and create your own case studies around this, right? Previously, like how people reacted, where were the different players in each, in terms of this intercultural sensitivity, in terms of this model. I'll change slides so you can see, what those, some examples of that is. But when in that situation that happened, were all the players in denial? Was one person in adaptation and another person in minimization? How were you able to work through that? What were some of the things, in terms of being able to really think about that? It's a really simple tool, in my opinion, to be able to just start dissecting some of, what happens in the workplace when it is not black and white, right? When it's not egregious, when it's not, sexual harassment, right? Where you need to get the authorities involved, and that there's very specific laws and specific issues, in terms of dealing with that, when there's not a blatant case of racism or, homophobia or Islamophobia or any of those things that can happen in the workplace. But when there's a lot of things going on, and there's a lot of even, people pointing fingers at each other, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of confusion, maybe misunderstandings, and even how did we as the professionals, as the leaders in the organizations, as the HR professionals, as the, as the management, did we minimize the situation? Did we say everybody has a conflict in or whatever, or you'll learn to like each other or whatever? Or did you really start to look at the world through different eyes and try to understand what was happening and where that was happening, and how you might be able to move forward with so many of the wonderful HR tools that we all have been taught and already utilize in our organizations? Okay. So moving on from that, I would like to go to a case study. Okay. I'd like to talk about something that happened at the Center for Newcomers a few years ago. And really, again, if we were able to be a little bit more interactive, if we were in person, then I would have asked people more in terms of what would you have done. But instead, I'm going to go through the scenario, and I'm going to, hopefully give you, while I'm talking through, you'll be thinking about it in your own heads in terms of, oh, okay, well, this is what I would have done or whatever else. And then I can tell you what we ended up doing. And I will critique it, right? You'll be critiquing it, I'm sure, as I'm talking about it. But then, in terms of, oh, Anila, you shouldn't have done that, or oh, that okay, whoa, maybe this would have been better. Or you could say, oh, that was a really good piece of, of information that I just learned, or oh, that was a really good way of handling it, right? So you're all going to have different reactions depending on your own dynamics at work and your own personalities and whatever else. And I've spent many years now critiquing it myself in terms of what could we have done better so that we could have moved forward in a much better way, right? So the situation as it occurred was we had a staff person that was working with a family, and And as part of our teams, we often, in most of our work, we work with multiple partners, right? We have over 150 MOUs signed with multiple partners because we can't be everything for everyone, right? So we have multiple agency partners that work with mental health. We have multiple that work with youth, that work with HR or employment or whatever else, right? So all the different things that we offer. So in this scenario, it was working with our youth, and we have 35 partners in our youth program that we work with specifically. One of the partners was going to a home visit with one of our staff people, and the family was that they were going to visit were permanent residents in Canada, but still national. So their home country was in South America, in one of the countries in South America. Okay. And so our staff person went to this home visit with the community partner, and they went through and they did the whole thing. And, it was a great home visit. They provided the services to the parents and to the youth. And, it was a great meeting. On the way back, and this is pre-COVID, so they were in the same car, right? No mask, no anything. On the way back, the community partner said to the CFN staff person, I didn't know that there were Black people in this country in South America. That was the comment. This comment really upset the staff person because the staff person believed it to be ignorant and racist. Okay, the staff person also happens to be Black themselves. Okay, their supervisor, the manager, also Black. Their person, like the senior leadership team person at CFN at the time, also Black. And incidentally, our board chair at the time, who I report to, also Black. Now, I'm only mentioning all of this because it's part of the context of what eventually ended up happening. So our staff person was very, very upset with this. And our community partner was very confused as to why the staff person was very upset by this. And, I'd like you to take a moment to kind of reflect on if it were you and you were me, the CEO, who happened to not be Black. Okay, so even if you are Black, pretend you're not, right? For a moment, and not of the culture that the person that from the other agency was either, right? So you're not a part of either of those cultures, and all of the people that are kind of in that chain of command, and even in your chain of command, is part of the culture, of one of the cultures, right? And it's getting quite heated in the sense that our staff person is very upset by this comment because they feel like the community partner is being racist and doesn't have the cultural competency skills to be working with the staff person, let alone with the clients. Okay. What would you do? How would you handle that situation? Okay. So here's what we did. Of course, I met with the manager, because it was the manager who informed me, and with the senior leadership person. And it was early on in my career as a CEO, right? I think it happened within the first year that I was CEO, about 5 or 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago. And so I wasn't really sure exactly, how to address this. I listened to what the managers were saying. And then I took it to my board chair. And I was extremely sensitive based on the fact that this was specifically around racism against a Black family and against, you know, as a staff person who was also identified. All of these people identified themselves as Black, not words that I'm putting to them in terms of an identifier, and you know, spoke to my board chair as well in terms of that. Now, the feedback that I received from the board chair and also from the management was that after speaking to the community partner acknowledges that it was the wrong choice of wording. Okay, it was not the appropriate choice of wording. It should not have, that the community partner was really thinking out loud and left that, and after that situation realized how inappropriate that would have sounded, and you know, apologized, offered to apologize, and then spoke to the fact that it really helped that community partner also think about what does that person, what do they see as a Canadian? Because I think that was the, well, they did say that was their aha moment, that they were like, whoa, there are people that are Black there? Oh my goodness, I see Canadians as a certain kind of person too. And this is the work that I'm doing with newcomers. Oh wait, I need to really check my own privilege and check my own biases. So that was all of the internal workings that was happening with this community partner that led them to make that comment. But they didn't say any of that stuff. They didn't have that conversation in terms of, you know, anything even remotely like, hey, you know, I just thought of something. Like if it was me, this is what I would have said, right? I would have said something like, I guess, you know, I just thought of something and I really don't understand how to work this through because I think I have some biases, right? Like I didn't realize that I have some internal biases of even what I see as a Canadian, because I didn't realize that people, you know, and this might be really ignorant, this is really ignorant of me, but I didn't realize that people in South America, you know, be born, raised there, and they are of African ancestry, they identify as Black. I didn't realize that, and it made me start thinking about in Canada and what I think about Canadians, and I'm horrified that this is what I think about as, you know, for Canadians. And that was really, that took months. That narrative that eventually came out of that partner took months of working together, months of communicating, months of talking to their supervisors and trying to figure out how do we continue a partnership around this, because this has really hurt, you know, our staff person, because they really did take it very personally. You know, how do we do this? And then even after that, working with that, our own staff person to say, you know, are you okay with this? What do you need to feel safe in terms of that? And then changing some of our policies around how we work with partners and what we expect from partners, and how we may be able to do joint presentations or do cultural competency training, and what are the needs of our partners that we might not have, right? We really needed to work on that, because after this is when we started doing work with our Indigenous community partners, and when we started doing work with our LGBT plus community partners. So we were now acutely aware that we might be making those same comments or those same kind of hurtful sayings or whatever without realizing it, right? Using our unconscious bias in very inappropriate ways. And we did have incidences like that, right? Where people did say things like that. And then because we had this incident and this case study really to work off of, I think it smoothed away because we were already thinking ahead in terms of how our staff might also not be sensitive towards LGBT plus community or Indigenous communities or other groups that we might be working with that we might not know. So that's how we ended up handling the situation. It wasn't perfect. It was really messy. It got really ugly at times. And we're still working on it, but that's just one, you know, case study to speak to that. The next thing that I wanted to talk about, and we're almost done actually, so I thank you for spending so much time with me already, is some of the best practices, right? So, and these are really practical kind of tips and things that have worked for us at the Center for Newcomers, and hopefully will work for you as well. And if they don't, please send me a line, let me know, what does work for you, and what might be better. So one of them is time. This is a process. It is going to take a lot of time. People are going to need to get, feeling more comfortable talking about different issues around diversity, equity, inclusion. Time needs to be regularly scheduled. It can't just be an afterthought or when an issue arises. It needs to be something that people are very comfortable with. It needs to be continuous, needs to be improved upon, where people are able to really speak to things that they're interested in or concerned about. And the process is a co-creation. Your entire team should be involved. And you should be seeking guidance from experts, whoever those experts you deem to be in the community, right? Like I said, for ourselves, we have an elders council that assists us so that that we feel like we're being guided appropriately, right? We haven't left it only to our settlement team or whatever to be involved in that, right? We open up everything to all of our team, and I am personally delighted when, for example, our finance team says, we'd like to learn, we'd like to, be able to participate, even though they never work with clients. And they're mostly only working, with the finances and with only certain people in our teams. But it's an important co-creation process for everybody to be involved in. And then have a contingency plan, right? How do you create safety? How are we ensuring that everyone feels safe, right? What are the rules of engagement to have these conversations and to be able to move forward? And if there is an incident, whether it is something that the police need to be involved in and, HR and your board and legal, or whether it is, something else where it's just highly uncomfortable and you need to work it out, do you have the crisis counseling in place? Do you have the experts in place that staff can confidentially speak to, can feel that they are able to communicate with, so that they have all of those resources available to them? And then speaking of resources, here are just three that I, of course, will always love to advocate for. If you go to our own website, centerfornewcomers.ca/workshops, you will see all of the different workshops we offer on cultural competency, LGBT+ training, all of the different kinds of things that we're doing and what we offer, not only for clients, but of course, even in terms of professional development and for staff. actiondignity.org. /programs. Action Dignity is a key partner of ours. They offer wonderful programming. They really work a lot when it comes to ethnocultural and racialized communities, and can really speak to you, especially from a really grassroots level, is a really excellent work that they do. And then the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. Good friend Anne-Marie Pham works there. They have a number of toolkits. That's more of what I was talking about at the beginning in terms of the academic side, the scientific side, the data, all of those kind of pieces, and how do you incorporate those things. The toolkits are downloadable. They're very good. And then they also have opportunities that you can have. You can actually work with them to be able to build out what diversity, equity, inclusion strategies in your organization look like. Okay, so with that, I will, open it up, ask Mary if there's any, questions that I can answer right now. I'm happy to do that. And then, here's just some information on the Center for Newcomers in terms of how you can become involved as and stay connected with us. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have a blog, LinkedIn. You can personally connect with me on any of those platforms as well, or anyone at the center. And I see that Mary is back now.
Great, thanks so much, Anila. So I think we're just going to jump right into that Q&A, and we do have a couple of questions to start us off. So again, if you do have questions for Anila, please feel free to type them into the question box. If we can't get to them today, they'll be considered for Anila's follow-up blog post. So this first question, can you speak about unconscious bias as an approach used in DE&I work? I feel it minimizes the impact of racism and other forms of discrimination and doesn't quite address the systemic barriers at the root of many of our issues in the workplace.
Yep, absolutely 100% correct, right? It's the concept of unconscious bias is important individually, right? It's an important tool to use as you discern for yourself where your understanding is of diversity, equity, inclusion, and where you are. It is often, I 100% agree, used as a tool for minimization when it comes to systemic changes. Oh, we just didn't know, we were unconscious of that, right? And really, there needs to be consequences. And we need to be able to be much more blatant in how we speak about systemic discrimination in the workplace and in our institutions, and not be accepting of that, right? So I am willing personally, and this is a personal choice of everyone, right? I am willing personally, as Anila, as a human being, I am willing to accept if somebody says to me that is in a position of power, we didn't realize, you know, that's my unconscious bias. I had absolutely no idea. I'm working on it. I'm willing to accept that with the caveat. My next question is, wonderful, what are you going to do to remove these barriers, and in what timeline and what time frame, and who is being involved and included in terms of ensuring that it is actually an appropriate measure? Without the action, the concept or the speaking of it means nothing, really, right? To me, speaking to unconscious bias is really around your own introspection in terms of where you are, right? But that's basically where it ends for me. Beyond that, especially when we talk about systemic discrimination, when we talk about systemic issues and barriers, we cannot use that as an excuse. It is minimization. So I hope that that answers the question. It's a great question.
Thanks, Anila. And just as a kind of a follow-up, also, this is a comment and a question, and perhaps you can just add to that. So it's a comment regarding the case study that you shared with us. I'm a Black woman, and I wouldn't consider this case as a case of racism, but ignorance. However, how do you, as an organization, get to a point where we make skills of cultural competency as a core skill? So this action piece as an organization. And one of the suggestions is we should change our hiring practices and look for these skills before hiring people on.
Yes, so that's a lot to unpack, because that gets me thinking in so many different directions. And if it looks like I'm looking somewhere else, it's because I've got multiple screens. So when I'm looking at Mary, I'm actually kind of like looking over there, but then I'm trying to look at everybody. So the wonders of you know, online. But I think, you know, yes, I think for us, in terms of whether that was racist or not, we didn't make a comment on that only because the staff person involved perceived it as racism. And so we wanted to be able to respect that piece of it. Mary, can you continue on with the rest of that, please? Just to, again, so that I have it straight in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just read that question. And so how do we as organizations get to a point where we make skills of cultural competency as a core skill? And so one of the suggestions is that looking at our hiring practices and looking for these skills before hiring people on. So if you can expand on that.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think it's so important. You would think at the Center for Newcomers, and this is one of the things I tell people all the time, just because we're called the Center for Newcomers and we're working with newcomers doesn't mean that we have to we don't actively practice cultural competency, right? And that we don't actively need to do that. We make this assumption that even the people that we're hiring are going to have all of these skills. And over the course of the years that in my tenure at the Center for Newcomers, we have actually started to hire based on those skills. People needed to prove it. If they said, well, I come from a diverse background, it's like, no, what kind of work have you done within this field? How would you handle these situations? We ask those kind of behavioral questions to be able to gauge where people are at. And we also ensure that people understand that if they're going to be joining the Center for Newcomers and they don't have that skill set and we think that they're a good fit, and even if they do have the skill set, everybody takes the training on cultural competency as an employee of the Center for Newcomers. Everybody takes the training on Indigenous education for newcomers. Everybody takes the training on the LGBT plus services, right? Everybody takes the training on sexual harassment and understanding employment standards, right? And so the onboarding can take a lot of time. It really can, and people get frustrated, and people get, well, there's so much to do and whatever else, but it's so important. The other thing that we recently learned, and don't laugh, is that almost all of our team needs to take Excel training, right? It's just part of something that we need to do, and I think that it's important that cultural competency, diversity, equity, and inclusion training is just a part of the skill set that every employee needs to have if they are going to work in there, regardless of how diverse your organization is or not. It's just a skill set that everyone needs to have. And so that's an extremely important suggestion, absolutely, that needs to be incorporated before you hire. But then also, as I was saying, continuously, in terms of almost like recertifications, right? There need to be, one of the things that we've done at the Center for Newcomers is that we've started to incorporate quizzes at the end. And it's very easy to do. You just do it like a Survey Monkey, right? You don't need to have anything fancy, right? It's mandatory to put the person's name in, and you've got 10 questions after the workshop. That was done. And after the workshop, everybody has 15 minutes to complete the survey, and then we get all of the results, and we see who passed and who didn't pass, and the people that didn't pass, we ask them to do it again until they until they pass. And pass is 100%, right? Like, you have to be able to answer all the questions appropriately and understand why. And that's a really important part of the work we do. And then also opportunities for, in our team meetings, because everybody's having team meetings, to be able to talk about case studies, to be able to talk about fictional things and real things and things that they heard about and things that are happening in the community, different systemic barriers and issues that are happening. What does that look like, and how do we advocate for that? Because we are a not-for-profit that does a lot of advocacy work around that. What's appropriate, what may not be appropriate, how do we work on that? What does that look like? What are our policies and procedures around that? Does that need to change? So those are just a lot of different ways that we would look at that.
Great, thanks, Anila. And I think we have time for one more question. So really quickly, you already touched on this just now, and this is in terms of kind of that safe space that you had mentioned. So you mentioned not to force communication and team building. What are some strategies to give staff the education and tools to engage in these conversations? And you already mentioned sort of like sharing of case studies. Any others that you could share?
It's give people assignments to do on their own during work hours that might be more engaging in different ways, right? So movies, right? Movies that are highly recommended, that are critically acclaimed, that speak to some of these topics and some of these issues, right? And book club, different things like that, different ways where people can find different ways to do that. And again, it's that co-creation. So some people might be like, okay, well, I'll watch the movie, but then I want to be able to discuss in person with people. I don't want to do a book club, right? Or whatever, or I don't want to, you know, like, or I don't want to do it by myself or whatever. So create teams of people that are cross-sectional that make people comfortable in the way that they're going to respond to that. So maybe everybody has the assignment that you have to watch the movie, but some people's assignment, depending on what their needs are, is going to be they're going to journal about it, you know, on their own. And then they can have a conversation with the team lead or HR or whoever, right, that they're comfortable with in terms of that one-on-one. Other people, it'll be like, no, we're just going to meet in a group and we're going to have a conversation around it and we're going to talk about it and whatever else, right? So find ways that I find are best. Is art and culture is extremely important, right? So art in terms of critically acclaimed, whether it's you know, theater, whether it's movies, whether it's poems or stories, or, you know, any of those kind of things that can get people engaged, right? Like we have all kinds of things that we can, you know, critically acclaimed books. Like The Illegal is an excellent example, you know, of Canadian literature that really speaks to what happens in a refugee journey and what happens in those kind of things, right? So with Lawrence Hill, for example, could be a great way of doing that. You know, guest speakers and just having, you know, where people don't actually have to talk, but they're just listening to dynamic guest speakers, being able to just talk about their lived experiences. Those would all be very useful to begin with.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anila. That just wraps it up for time. I feel like we can continue this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us. I look forward to reading more thoughts on your follow-up blog post, which everyone will be receiving an email for. And you can also locate at on our website, calgarycvo.org. Please feel free to check webinars from the rest of the series there as well, and information about how you can attend events like Nonprofits at 2 and membership. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Land Solutions and Altitude Communications, and to the CCBO team who work behind the scenes to produce this webinar, and to you, the audience, for spending this time with us. We hope you can join us again soon.